Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'll be analyzing the case of Brandon Durham. First, I'll look at the background in this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Brandon Durham was born in 1981 and lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. He worked as a real estate agent and lived in a 1,200 square foot two-bedroom house on Wine River Drive. Brandon maintained multiple romantic relationships. One of his casual sexual partners was a woman named Alejandra. She was from Seattle, Washington. The pair met on a dating app sometime around October 2024. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Tuesday, November 12, 2024, at 12:40 a.m., 43-year-old Brandon Durham called 911. He told the operator that two people were outside his house, shooting into his house and trying to gain entry. Brandon was in his house with his 15-year-old daughter, Isabella. Later, a police report indicated that one other person was in the house, a woman who has not been identified. I'll talk more about her story in my analysis. As the 911 call continued, Brandon said the perpetrators entered his house through the front and back doors. In response, he was locking himself in the bathroom. 3 patrol officers arrived at Brandon's house. One of them was a 26-year-old officer named Alexander Bookman. The officers noticed that there were vehicles in the driveway which had been damaged, and there was damage to multiple windows of the house. They heard screaming and banging coming from inside the house. Officer Bookman kicked in the front door and made entry. He walked down an L-shaped hallway. The officer was holding his service pistol, a Glock 17, chambered in 9mm Luger. As the officer turned left down the hallway, he encountered Brandon and Brandon's 31-year-old casual sexual partner, Alejandra. There's no reason to believe the officer knew who these people were, like he probably didn't know that Brandon was the one who called 911. Brandon and Alejandra appeared to be involved in a physical confrontation as they were standing in the doorway of the bedroom. They were struggling over a knife. Both of them had their hands on the knife, which was behind Alejandra, being pushed against the doorframe by Brandon. Officer Bookman gave verbal commands to drop the knife. Less than 2 seconds after issuing the first command, he discharged his service weapon 1 time, striking Brandon in the head. This caused both Brandon and Alejandra to fall to the floor. As they fell, they both let go of the knife. The officer then advanced toward them and fired at Brandon 5 more times. So he shot the person who called for help. The police rendered medical assistance to Brandon, but he died at the scene. Alejandra was arrested. She told the officer that he shot the wrong person. As the police were taking her out of the house, Alejandra told Brandon's daughter, Isabella, quote, "I was doing the community a favor, including you," unquote. Alejandra was charged with 4 offenses, including performance of act in willful or wanton disregard of safety of persons resulting in death, and home invasion with a deadly weapon. Even though Brandon referred to a firearm during his 911 call, the alleged perpetrator, Alejandra, did not have a firearm. Rather, she retrieved 2 knives from Brandon's kitchen. At the time I'm making this video, the officer who killed Brandon is on paid administrative leave as the investigation into the incident continues. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Alejandra spoke to investigators after being arrested. According to the police, here's what she told them. Alejandra was frustrated with Brandon because he was maintaining multiple romantic relationships. This statement appears to be accurate. Brandon's daughter told the police that Brandon had parties almost every night in a garage, which was converted into a man cave. A few hours before the shooting, Alejandra was at Brandon's house when he wasn't there. When he returned home, he told her to leave. Alejandra made her way to the airport in an Uber with the intent of flying home. Presumably, she was returning to Seattle, Washington. At the airport, she was informed that her ticket had been canceled because someone reported that it was purchased with a stolen credit card. Alejandra returned to Brandon's house with the intent of dying. Specifically, she intended on encouraging the police to open fire on her. As for Brandon's fate, she stated, quote, "I wanted him to live with the wreckage that I caused in his house," unquote. Alejandra broke the windows of vehicles in the driveway using a propane tank and used bricks to break the windows in the house. This may explain why Brandon thought his house was being struck by gunfire. Alejandra made entry into the house and grabbed 2 knives from Brandon's kitchen. She dropped one of those knives before initiating a struggle with Brandon in the doorway of his bedroom. A witness, presumably Brandon's daughter, heard Alejandra say something to the effect of, "Hey Brandon, you think you can blank me off? You think you can screw me over? Yeah, who's daddy now? Who's daddy now?" After this, Officer Bookman killed Brandon. Alejandra said the officer could have used his taser, but she knew he would use a gun. When Alejandra was asked if she felt responsible for Brandon being shot and killed, she responded, "Of course, I feel like I'm responsible for what led up to everything." The police suspected that Alejandra attempted to blow up Brandon's house by turning on a gas stove. I guess this was when she was in the kitchen where the knives were. Like, she retrieved the knives, but then had this idea to blow up the house as well. She is also facing separate felony charges unrelated to Brandon's death. So Alejandra may be in even more trouble than it would initially appear. Item number 2. As I mentioned, in addition to Brandon, his daughter, and Alejandra, there was an unidentified woman in the house during the incident. She told the police that Brandon had brought her into the house earlier that night. After spending some time together, he prepared a drink for her which tasted unusual. The woman passed out and did not regain consciousness until a crime scene analyst found her behind the couch at 6 a.m. So the police never cleared the house. It took them 5 hours to find a person in it. That doesn't make them look particularly competent. I can picture that crime scene analyst finding the woman and yelling, "Hey boss, I may have found a clue." Item number 3. This controversial shooting has angered many members of the public. Some people believe that Officer Alexander Bookman should be charged with manslaughter or even murder. Some believe that any use of deadly force by the officer was unjustified. Others argue that the first shot could be explained by the chaotic nature of the situation, like it was confusing. But there is no excuse for the additional 5 shots when Brandon was no longer holding the knife. This brings me to the question, should Officer Alexander Bookman be charged with a crime like manslaughter or second-degree murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he should be charged, starting with the inculpatory factors. There is no question that Officer Bookman caused Brandon's death. He shot him one time when Brandon and Alejandra were holding the knife. There was no way for the officer to know who the aggressor was. After shooting Brandon in the head, the officer shot at him 5 more times. Brandon let go of the knife after the first shot. He was unarmed as the officer continued shooting. Even if he could somehow justify that first shot, what threat was the officer responding to at this point? During the incident, Brandon was calling for help, and he was in his underwear. These are both clues suggesting he was the victim and not the perpetrator. Furthermore, Brandon was holding the knife along with Alejandra. He had the knife pinned against the doorframe behind her body. This position is consistent with Brandon trying to defend himself from Alejandra, not the other way around. If Brandon was the aggressor, why would the knife be behind Alejandra? The officer yelled, "Drop the knife," twice before shooting Brandon, but the gunshot occurred less than 2 seconds after the command was initially given. It's not clear how Brandon could have followed the command, even if he had time. If Brandon was trying to hold the knife held by the aggressor, letting go of the knife would not have been a good idea, mostly because of the stabbing part. Brandon did not have any good options. He could have been stabbed by Alejandra or shot by the police officer. How did the officer not appreciate what was going on? Some may argue that Brandon appeared to be more threatening because of his size, but actually, Alejandra was heavier than Brandon. She was 220 pounds compared to Brandon at 185 pounds. Even without considering the weight, automatically assuming the man is the aggressor is not an acceptable strategy. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Maybe the officer did not realize the person who called 911 was a man. A person could break into a house wearing underwear. The first shot could have simply been a mistake. The officer saw Brandon's hand on the knife and made a bad decision. There was no malicious intent He didn't have time to figure out what was going on. He was worried that Brandon was going to kill Alejandra and felt like he needed to act quickly. Police officers are put in situations sometimes where they only have a split second to make a decision. As far as the additional shots, maybe the officer didn't see the knife drop to the floor. So in all the confusion and all the excitement, he didn't realize what happened. He didn't realize that Brandon was unarmed. That's pretty much it for the exculpatory factors. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I think the officer should be charged with a crime? Yes. In my opinion, he should be charged with second-degree murder. This officer demonstrated an extreme disregard for human life. If he had only fired one time, I would have been fine with manslaughter. But of course, this officer advanced and fired 5 more times. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Brandon was a popular figure romantically. He engaged with a number of women. He probably did not possess a sophisticated screening process. Alejandra appeared to have some anger problems and decided to destroy Brandon's life. She believed the police would shoot her, but Brandon was killed instead. The officer fired on Brandon because he thought he had the situation figured out. He saw a man, a woman, and a knife, and assumed the man was the aggressor. The reason the officer followed up with additional shots was his high level of confidence that his first shot was justified. The officer probably viewed all the shots as part of the same act involving the justified use of lethal force. However, he was badly mistaken. He was never justified in killing Brandon. Now moving to my final thoughts. This case is yet another example of a person calling the police for help only to be killed by the police. People may start thinking that calling the police can only make things worse. Like when being attacked by an armed intruder, they might ask themselves, do I want to add a second armed assailant to the mix? This fear is particularly justified in a situation where it is difficult to tell the difference between the perpetrator and the victim. Police don't always take the time to figure out what's going on. Sometimes they act too quickly and, on occasion, use lethal force. In the case of Brandon Durham, Alejandra created a confusing situation for the responding officer. However, it was the officer's job to make sure he was justified before using lethal force. This highlights the need for critical thinking skills. Officers should never make assumptions. During a violent incident, an officer may feel wrong in not taking action. However, an incorrect action will feel even worse. Whether or not the officer in this case is charged, he will have to live with his poor decision for the rest of his life. Those are my thoughts in the case of Brandon Durham. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Some people may wonder about the report of the unidentified woman. She made it sound like Brandon drugged her. Like when you look at her statement to the police, that doesn't look too good for Brandon. I don't know if this really has any bearing on the shooting. I don't think Brandon's alleged prior bad acts will make a difference. He should not have been shot by the officer. It's really as simple as that. He was looking for help, he was trying to protect himself, and he was shot and killed in his own house. He may have not been a great guy, like he may have done things wrong in the past. I don't know. That one report makes it seem like he did, but that's not really related to the shooting. I think they can be separated. I think it's reasonable to separate that allegation from what happened. It's interesting, though, situations like this do bring up the past. Like Brandon's past will be examined thoroughly, as will the officer's past and, of course, Alejandra's past. So there may be other factors that are detected in this investigation that can maybe change the perception of guilt here. I'd be surprised, but it's important to let the investigation finish and see what is discovered. Who knows what information might come out? It might be way more complicated than it initially looked.